Welcome to Illuminating Hope, a podcast of Hope House. In this series, Advocating Justice, the Legal Battle, we dive into the legal battles that shape the fight for domestic violence survivors. In each episode, we bring you powerful conversations with the legal teams, court advocates, and change makers working tirelessly to bring justice, protection, and hope to survivors of domestic violence. From the courthouse to policy changes, from survivors' rights to legal strategies, we uncover the critical role the justice system plays in breaking cycles of abuse. Whether you are a survivor, advocate, or someone passionate about justice, this podcast series will empower and inform you. Justice isn't just about the law. It's about giving survivors a voice, protection, and a future. Mary K. O'Malley has been the director of the Child and Family Service Clinic and clinical professor at UMKC Law since 2002. She obtained her Bachelor's of Arts from the St. Mary's of the Woods College in Indiana and her Master's of Arts from UMKC. After working as a social worker for the Missouri Division of Family Services for 13 years, she returned to law school and graduated from Washburn University School of Law in Topeka, Kansas. Following law school, Professor O'Malley was employed as a prosecuting attorney at the Jackson County Family Court for 6 years. After leaving court, she was partnered at a private practice, focusing her practice in areas of juvenile and family law. Mary Kay, welcome to the Illuminating Hope podcast. We are so glad you're here.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I want to first get to know you a little bit. So tell us about your work history and tell us about working at the law school and the GAL clinic.
So for my work history, in the late 70s, actually early 80s, I began working for the Children's Division, which now it's so funny because it was the Division of Family Services, and I always thought they're never going to get used to calling it Children's Division, and now here I am used to calling it Children's Division. But I worked for the Division of Family Services, and initially I started out in income maintenance. And in fact, because I had a master's degree, not in social work, but in theater actually, that I had a master's degree, I was qualified to go into child protection, but that kind of actually sounded so strange to me that I wasn't used to it. I said, oh no, I'm used to entertaining children. I'm not used to worrying about their safety. So I started in income maintenance. I bring that up because I did that for about a year and a half until I realized, no, I don't like this. But I remember coming home often saying to myself, wow, people really get upset when you take their money away from them. When I was doing food stamps, basic eligibility for food stamps, and setting AFDC at that time, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, which now is TANF. Having come from my background, was very privileged. I think it was a good introduction to the living actuality of people who at the mouth of poverty, basically, or not, but just living in difficult situations in crisis, because I came from an intact, successful family. That was good. But then I got the opportunity to go to child protection. So I went to child protection, and I found that I really loved that. It really fit into all of my kind of performative skills. I would often be at court testifying and writing reports, which I love to write. And so all of that, along with the people, it really fit all my skills, and I really enjoyed it. And then after about a year, I remember driving home thinking, wow, I thought they got mad if you took their money. Now when you take their children, effects on families and on people. So really enjoyed that. First of all, at that time, that agency was full of people raised in the 60s. We all believed strongly in social justice, believed strongly in not judging people because of their situations, but rather trying to understand them and see how we could help them within the context of their situations, because we understand that we can't change who a child is born to, or we can't change some of the circumstances of a parent's born with mental illness or something like that you can't change. So that's just something we learn to deal with and learn to address and hopefully help those people. So I was very privileged to work with so many people that taught me, raised me, first as a professional, but second also in the area of human services. Then from there, I decided I wanted to go to law school. And the reason I decided I wanted to go to law school was, number one, I didn't have the social work degrees to go on and do any further type of social work. And I knew I needed to make more money in order for my own personal family life. So I decided I would go to law school, and the reason was because I wanted to advocate for children in a more meaningful way. In other words, I wanted to shape law, write law. So after I finished law school, I got the job of my dreams, which was the job I wanted when I went to law school. And when I came out of law school, everything just seemed to fall into place and work for me, which was I became an attorney for the juvenile officer here in Jackson County, which means I was basically a prosecuting attorney on the juvenile front. I worked there for 6 years, and the last 3 years of it, I was the team leader for the termination of parental rights team. I really was focused on review hearings for families as they were going through the court system, focusing on what was well and what wasn't going well, and whether it was going to look like we were moving towards termination of parental rights. And then I and the other attorney and the paraprofessionals I had working with us had prepared all the termination of parental rights cases for trial and appeal after following that. After that, I decided to go into private practice for a bit, and I went and joined a gentleman I'd gone to law school with who had briefly worked at the juvenile office. He and I handled a practice that was completely focused on juvenile appointments, so delinquency cases and anything else that came out of the abuse and neglect TPR or the original abuse cases. And then I was offered it. And then in 2002, this opportunity came up for me to move to the law school. They were looking for someone to run their child and family services clinic. And really at that point, I remember my interview so well because I just happened to say something that resonated with them, I think. I said, I looked at the two professors that were interviewing me and they said, why do you want this job? Why do you want it now? Of course, expected question, but I hadn't really thought that much about it, funny enough, but I didn't. And I came out with this, well, let me say this. Have you ever had something happen in your life and you looked at it and you thought, this explains the rest of my life? For this job, I'm going to come in and teach law students or work with law students on representing actual clients and actual cases involving child custody. And usually in my case, because that was my bailiwick, it was child protection. So that's what I made the clinic all about. We never had a case that didn't have a child at the center of the case. We didn't just do divorces. So I said to them, this makes sense. So I had to be a social worker to understand the system of what's out there for family. And then I went on and I actually became a prosecutor. So I understood the law and I knew how the law worked with families. And one of the questions, big things you have as a prosecutor is not just what you can do, what you should do, and especially in the area of families. So like for the criminal prosecutors, they can go forward and prosecute that criminal act of abuse without thinking about the child, but we can't do that in the family court system. Peter, my partner, one time pointed out to me, it's called family court. It's not called children's court. It's called family court. And I think when you think about it from that perspective, you understand we're not on some high horse that we're here to rushing in to protect this child, and so therefore everything we do is what is right and what is said. We can't adopt that attitude because this child is a member of a constellation, if you will, and you can't just pluck them out of there and think, oh, okay, well, that's done. That's not going to have an effect when you go place them back within the system. It's one of the reasons I didn't care for prosecuting juveniles myself. I asked to be relieved of that because I would see that a lot of times we put a 14, 15-year-old offender in Hilltop for 6 months based on their offense and their propensity, their need for structure, and etc. And then we would return them to the home and say, now it's up to you to hold it together, kid. Well, they're still 14 or 15, so impulsivity, all the things that go along with adolescence still there. And we haven't really fixed the family. We haven't done anything about the family, which is probably why they're in trouble in the first place. So it's always that question, what came first when you're dealing with a delinquent? What came first? The horse of the cart, child abuse and neglect often came first. And then what you're seeing is the result in some type of criminal behavior or conduct on the part of juveniles. That's why early intervention is so important, because we're trying to prevent, not only are we trying to improve the lives, if you want it from a governmental perspective of, is this worth the money we're spending? Well, I don't know all the answers to that, but I do know that if we don't do that, we just pay for the costs later of either incarceration, of course, litigation, all the costs that go along with court processes has failed. And I don't mean we didn't try and we failed at our attempts. I mean, it has failed to achieve the result we want. But I think that we can't just throw up our hands. Got this opportunity to go teach the students. So when I said to them, the professors, then I had to go out in private practice so I would know how to represent a client and how to work with parents and children from their perspective. And I found that probably the easiest transition because I'd been a social worker. Our goal was to get those kids home as soon as possible. So I went in and really worked hard. And again, I'm saying that I worked around a lot of wonderful, intelligent, trained people. I feel like they raised me up and they made me capable. And I do think that I found that this was a really good skill for me, for my life and who I am and what I do or what I can bring to a job. So I just realized this is where I belong. So I told them too that I had the opportunity to represent children as a guardian ad litem when in private practice as well. Social worker to prosecutor to private practice representing parents and children. Now I could be able to teach it. So that's why I said to them, see, this job is making sense of the rest of my life, because truthfully I thought I'd be working in the theater 18, 20. This was really where my life was headed.
It really makes sense listening to that transition from each of those, it's like one step led to the other, and then here you are at the ultimate journey.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
My favorite thing about teaching and being at the law school was that ability to share my passion for child protection. We would hold meetings just to share with the students, the whole student body, about what clinics are and what they accomplish. So early in their law school career, probably in the first semester, first year, but we would meet with them, and one of the things I would always say to them, I'd take that opportunity and say, listen, if you never take one of my courses or any of the other family law classes, children out here need representation. They need good lawyers, not just people who care about children. They need good lawyers. You, as you go forward in your practice, no matter what you do, you're going to want to be doing some pro bono work. One, it's an expectation of our profession, but it's also, you have, in a society based on the rule of law, a law degree, a law license. Practice is an extremely important tool to help, and it's also an important tool that could be used to hurt. Obviously, we promote help. I would always, no matter any contact I had with the student body, whether they were going to be my students or not, I would encourage them to be trained and to look out for these opportunities to represent the folks who are working with families or to actually work with the families themselves, because our children need this. I thought this about social work too, but in my opinion, the most important pressing need is children. Because as we go forward, if we don't build strong children, then we're not building a strong community, we're not building a strong society, and eventually we're not building a strong country.
Because each of those patterns just repeat themselves. The younger start to do the same that's been happening over and over.
There's a book out right now I think is really interesting. I think I would recommend for everybody to read in regards to children. It's called The Anxiety Generation. It's talking about why are kids so anxious and why are so many on meds? Why is this going on? Why are kids so lonely? I mean, we can see some obvious things, well, the internet and all of this bullying that goes on online that we didn't have as children, that we were not exposed to. It's a hard time to grow up, and it's a hard time to be a parent.
You've been through a lot of the systems. What improvements have you seen through the years, but what improvements still need to be made?
Well, I think the biggest improvement is there's been a lot of training that has gone on. Hope House, for example, has engaged in a lot of community education, outreach. So I think that's the biggest advantage, that we talk about things and we're educating ourselves about how to talk about it and when to talk about it and what to do with that. But very worried about the status of our children and our families right now. We're in a period of time where budget cuts seem to be all we're concerned about, but I think people forget those are real people behind those cuts. Right now, I think it's very worrisome because not only are there income issues that are going to affect families because they're losing sources of income or money or, whatever that might be, but also I'm concerned about the rate of giving to charities that provide services to families, because now that they don't get to make personal deductions on their taxes or just because of their own financial situations, I'm concerned that there's less giving going on, so therefore less giving, less money. Everything costs money. And like I would say, it costs a lot of money to raise a family. Ask anybody out there doing it. I don't care if they make $25,000 or they make $250,000. They're going to say it costs a lot of money to raise a family. So I don't understand why we don't understand that it's going to cost a lot of money to raise a country and to raise children. Everyone is born equally in terms of their humanity and in terms of their value as an individual in human life, and we all believe that. We're not born equally in terms of our opportunities and being born in the family that you're born in. I feel like I won the lottery, but I didn't choose. I didn't deserve that. God's divine plan, whatever you want to call it. But then if you think that way, then there's some plan that people live much harder lives. Children live much harder lives. And I think it's also in the plan that those of us who are not and are capable to assist, that we would reach out. We would be there to assist. So that's my biggest worry, is that right now there is not enough resources, and that there's a move to remove resources from the most vulnerable people, and certainly among the most vulnerable are children.
What have you seen change? What has improved?
The biggest thing I've seen change is the Children's Division. When I was there was a lot of respect for that job. I used to say, though, that being a Children's Division worker is hard because you practice in a fishbowl. Everybody sees what you do because you're writing reports, or you're telling your supervisor, you're going to court, you're telling the guardian ad litem, whatever, you're exposing everything that you're doing. So you're operating in a fishbowl. Everybody has an opinion on what you could have done or not done. I remember one time that there was a set of twins that there was a hotline on. There had been a hotline, and so agency, the Division of Family Services, was working with this parent, and the worker, the ongoing caseworker from the division, went out, and she saw these two twins, and they were underweight. That was one of the problems, failure to thrive. And the next day, one of them died, or 2 days later, one of them died. And I mean, the furor to try to prosecute this worker. I'm like, she's not a medical person. All of that had been put in place. We thought, what could you do? I once testified in front of the legislature in a committee meeting on a bill that they were trying to pass that would criminalize Children's Division workers. And I went and testified. I said, look, I can't tell you everything that's happened across the state, because of course I don't know it, but I will tell you this. I know of no children's division worker that's killed a child or abused a child, frankly. I can't help that a parent isn't doing what they're doing. Now, if this woman hadn't seen the children or something, that would have been different, but she had seen them. She didn't recognize a baby can go down in 24 hours from failure to thrive, from dehydration or something. They can go very quickly, and I think that's what happened in this instance. But it was really the aftermath that was really upsetting to all of us, because then how are you going to get people to do this job, especially for the amount of money, with the amount of pressure and stress? And I will say this, there is no person in the system that makes harder decisions than the child abuse investigator and the judge. Those are the two. Because I went home at night having to think, did I do the right thing by not calling the court? Did I do the right thing by not doing something further than what I did? Was it enough to tell them you're going to be at Children's Mercy Hospital by 6 o'clock, or I'm sending the police out? I'm going to request protective custody because I can't ensure their safety. But if you go to the hospital and we hear a child's being seen and taken care of, then we can go forward. We can figure out what in the aftermath of that. But if I can't trust that you'll get there. So there were a lot of nights I spent, when I went to law school, I remember this just sense of relief that all I had to worry about was me for a while. Didn't have to be worried about someone dying overnight, a child being hurt again or something like this. Experience one time that I had an investigation, and I'd already referred it to the court because they weren't responding to me. I couldn't get a hold of them. And it was a 2-year-old child, and it was our Christmas party, and that's why I probably remember it so well. It was the Christmas party during the day at the division, so on all the floors of the state office building, parties were going on, people were having a good time, and I got a call from the police department. They picked up this child, and it was the child that I had an open investigation on that I'd referred to court because I couldn't get them to cooperate. And so I went over and picked her up. They had found her. They found her underneath a bed in the basement. They had hidden her, tried to hide her from the police when they went in for an unrelated matter. She had bruising. She looked like a bandit. She had bruising across her eyes like this, black and blue, all the way across her eyes. So I had a 2-year-old child sitting in my lap at my desk while the party is going on in the room, trying to find a foster home for her at that time. At that time we were responsible to get them ourselves, and so was putting in calls trying to find a home for her 2 days before Christmas. I remember everybody coming by me at desk, all this jolly, and then stop a minute, they saw the child in my lap. It's a reminder of every day how we were out there. Even on Christmas Day, I volunteered to several Christmas days to do investigations because people were going out of town, and I lived here and my family was here, so that wasn't a big deal to me, knocking on this door. So what has changed is the children's. That's the biggest change. One thing about this, when you privatize things, you don't necessarily get better. I don't even think you necessarily get cheaper. Try to privatize the foster care or a lot of child protection work. And I believe under law, the one thing that they can't is child abuse investigations. They cannot give that out. That's state duty or responsibility. But because they've gutted the agency, they've left workers there without enough people to do the jobs, and they're complained about. And I think the morale has really been low over a number of years. And when the private agencies opened up, who did they hire first? The best workers from the state. So yeah, you think you get best, but I don't know that that's always the case. One advantage I think there is to privatization is that they are allowed to do things. They can use other providers, contract with them with the money that's given to them to contract with providers that may not be available to the state, don't have a state contract. In that sense, that part of it I think can be better. I think the agencies are fine. I don't make necessarily any criticisms against the agencies, but they've left the state agency crippled. And that's the hub. That's where everyone's going to begin with. So, and that's where all the investigators are.
I think one of the things that we've talked about this before, but you really are highlighting, is that there's not one simple answer to this problem, and it takes a village to address the problem. You can't just say, I'm going to do this, and then this all goes away. And I think that from my experience, it just seems like people want a simple, easy answer. For us, we hear all the time, if she would just leave, then it would be fine. We all know that that's not true, but it's the same no matter what system we're looking at. People want that quick, easy answer that doesn't cost a lot of money and it's not going to cause lots of pain, but that you can't address families, the families that are in crisis, that are going through the kinds of things you're talking about. You can't just do that in a very simple, easy manner and that it's just going to be okay after that. And as we cut those budgets, as we continue to have this ideal that we have these functional, well-meaning, well-acting families that thriving, the people that are helping to make sure that happens, the support systems, the agencies, they're not getting the resources they need to support these families.
I am really interested to know the remedies that some of your students come up with.
It is amazing. Well, there's two things that I've had an opportunity in terms of just working with law students in general, but I also was the director of the Kansas City Youth Court for a number of years, so I had the opportunity to work with high school students that were interested in law and wanted to come forward and do this as their community service. And then it's a peer court, so train high school students basically to handle the cases and as prosecutors, defense attorneys, and judges. We had a youth court model that uses peer judging as well, not adults. And I remember telling the other professors, you should have the opportunity of working with adolescents as well, because the law students are all adults. And sometimes you sit there they look at you and you sit there they're thinking, okay, I dare you to teach me something today, something different, or please don't bore me, or come on, let's just get this over. I've got 3 hours of reading I've got to do after this class, or they're working or whatever. There's just so much going on in their heads. You sit in class, you ask a question, nothing, silent. And so you ask it again, another way, or you prod, whatever, and not. One of the professors taught me that you just don't say anything. So I started just standing there until they got uncomfortable and somebody would say something. But adolescents were so anxious to just, they're so engaged. Answers from all corners of the room if I posed a question. But I said, it's really fun to teach them. Law students do come up with things. They're thinking outside the box. One time this was back at my work life when I was prosecuting, it was 5 o'clock, always on 5 o'clock on a Friday, would Truman Medical Center call with an emergency right to the juvenile office. Mother's presenting, she doesn't speak English, she's in labor, having labor problem, but they want to do a C-section, she's refusing, she's left the hospital, they're all concerned, what's going to happen to the baby, they call us. Well, at the time, what could we do about that? But I remember sitting around for hours, and the immediate thought was, now we can't do anything, there's no child in being yet, and the laws don't kick in until but that was the easy answer, right? We sat around for half an hour, 40 minutes, just teasing it out. Well, maybe we could use this one. Because, an interesting fact that probably most people don't know is that the first child abuse case, literally the first legal child abuse case, was in New York and involved a child, Mary Ellen, I believe was her name, but people were concerned about her safety. Her mother was beating her. She was just in a mess situation, a very bad one. And people became aware of it, and they tried to take steps to take the child to protect her, but there was no law in place. You couldn't do anything about it, because at that time, matters were handled within the family, weren't discussed, and the law didn't address it and didn't really deal with it. And so good lawyers, and this is what good lawyers do, they find ways, and good lawyers decided, well, what is she? She's a human being, and what is that? That's an animal. So they used the animal cruelty laws to get child protection for. And that was the first time we had a case where the law here in the United States had actually protected a child based on abuse by the parent. But they had to use the animal cruelty laws to get to it, because there was a lot of that because of the use of horses and livestock and transporting goods and all of that. So the carriage rides, etc., that they would want protection of the animals or good care of the animals. So we understood that they were under our care, but not our children. So that's what it took. So it takes really creative minds and really working within it to push. That leads me to say that then those lawyers need to be the lawyers that we're looking at pursuing putting on the bench, because those are the lawyers that are going to assist and help. Law, like all things, all professions now, have become so specialized in many cases. So I do family law, or I do juvenile law, or I do insurance defense, or I do railroad law, or whatever. We're just so specialized. We seem to have limited pool of attorneys that are addressing any area, and in family law is one. And I train a lot of them, and they go out, and I've had a number of really good students, strong students within 3 to 5 years. They just can't handle family law anymore. So it takes not just the legal knowledge, but it also takes something inside the person that's able to separate their life from the stress of the work that they're doing, like in any area, any practice.
How do you guide your student body to handle secondary trauma?
Well, first of all, I talk to them about recognizing it. And I talk about self-care. I try to go beyond it, beyond what you would normally talk about, which is just, make sure you're getting rest, you're eating well, you're exercising well, that you're taking time for yourself, your family, you're doing the things, just being aware of where you are in yourself. I try to go a little bit beyond that, because part of it has to do with law practice. I'm holding up right now my cell phone to demonstrate to you. Here's our biggest problem right here. It used to be you go to work, you did your work, you went home. Nobody bugged you all night. Nobody bugged you and nobody expected an answer within 5 minutes. And they're going, why isn't she texting me back? Or why isn't she emailing me or whatever? This is a nightmare to our lives. I believe it's not in the way that we're using it. If it's just for safety and keeping kids in contact with their parent when they're separated so that you can do it, all good and done. But kids on the internet or watching other kids at their school bully them, or the constant, what's it doing to our brains and our minds, our eyesight, whatever we're doing by constantly looking at some kind of screen, all of this has kind of affected us as well and how we do things. I tell them, in your law practice, structure it in a way. I know you're going to feel like you would never have a moment off, that you could work constantly if you stayed at your job, and you probably could, because one thing, we're always researching law too. You have to find a way to focus yourself so that you're giving yourself some protected time, and some of that comes down to saying, I can't take the case, I don't have time for it now. And nobody, especially young lawyers, want to do that because they don't want to miss the money, because they need the income. It's all those. It's a much bigger, broader discussion than just meditate, do yoga, do the kinds of things that the social sciences would tell us to do.
We all know about those things, but we don't necessarily do them.
Yeah, We don't necessarily practice them. That's
the
true.
other part.
But I think it's really important with kids too. We need to tell, coping skills. Everything's a learning opportunity. I just watched my sister with her kids when they were little. They're now, 40s, but with their kids when they were little, and I would see her repeat a word or say, just even placing a plate down on the table, and the way she'd say, now don't eat all this, or because this will do this or that, whatever she'd say, just meaningless really in the big picture. But in the little picture, the micro picture, everything was a learning opportunity. Everything was a teaching opportunity. I guess I kind of see that too. For me, everything's a learning opportunity. I love learning. The thing about lawyers is you have to be interested in being a lifelong learner, because the law is not static. It's going to change all the time. You've got to be up for it. You wouldn't go in and, if you were a lawyer, and prosecute or defend a railroad case without knowing a lot about whatever the issues are, the braking systems, the rails themselves, whatever it might be that you need to know to be a lawyer. Why would you ever think you should do that in family law or representing children? You have to learn about all the systems. For a family law lawyer, that can include things that a lot of us don't like, which is tax consequences of agreements and that kind of stuff. A lot of us don't really love that. We like the people work. We don't necessarily like all the paperwork or the more technical stuff, especially if it involves money and math and taxes. We have to do them. And I think the more educated, the more learning you engage in, the more comfortable you are with it. But that's going to be true of the family law attorney, person that's serving as a guardian ad litem, that they need to know a lot about what's out there for families.
When you're talking about the constant learning, then that makes me think about the education of domestic violence and how that system, keeping with the children with a non-offending parent, and how that wasn't necessarily how it began, but how our community worked towards that in cross-training with Children's Division and DV workers and law enforcement and, stuff that the KCMBF has done yearly, that their conference in October, and just some of the things that we all kind of worked in a silo, and that now that learning that you're talking about kind of makes me, okay, so that's where this education piece really has to come in, so that lethality is looked at when you're trying to figure out how to place these kids. What's going on in that home is important. As adult protective system need to have the same education, need to have the same information to be able to cross and work together.
Well, frankly, let's get more personal about it and selfish about it. The lawyers need to understand it, because they could be in danger while you're out there working with these cases. These are cases that are the most likely to result in violence towards the court, towards judges. If you see the judges that are killed, it's not usually over a tort matter. It's not over a business litigation. It's almost always related to family. I had a student who graduated probably 19 years ago or something, but only about 5 years ago, maybe 7 years ago, a guardian ad litem in her practices up in Minnesota, but a guardian ad litem in the area who had been appointed to Litem was killed by the father in the case. In her office, just walked in and shot her. The education of understanding when are people more dangerous or not. It's not a guarantee, but it's certainly better than nothing in terms of understanding your safety and the safety of the families you're working with.
Thank you for joining us. This wraps up part 1 of our conversation with attorney and professor Mary K. O'Malley. Be sure to tune in to part 2, where we'll continue exploring her journey, her work with families, and the impact of policy and education on our communities.